Today in Black History, we will be discussing Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was born on February 1st, 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. His parents, James Hughes and Carrie Langston, separated soon after his birth, and his father moved to Mexico. Langston published his first poem in 1921. He attended Columbia University but left after 1 year to travel. He's most known for being a famous poet in the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote his first book in 1926 and later went on to write countless works of poetry, prose, plays. Here are some of his famous works. In November 1924, Hughes returned to the United States and worked various jobs. In 1925, he was working as a busboy in Washington, D.C. hotel restaurant when he met an American poet, Vachel Lindsay. Hughes showed him some of his poems, who was impressed enough to use his connections to promote Hughes' poetry and ultimately bring him to a bigger audience. In 1925, Hughes' poem, The Weary Blues, won first prize in the Opportunity Magazine literary competition, and Hughes also received a scholarship to attend Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. While he was studying at Lincoln, he ran into the novelist and critic Carl Van Vechten, who used his connections to help him get his first book of poetry, The Weary Blues, published by Knopf in 1926. The book had a popular appeal and established both his poetic style and commitment to Black themes and heritage. Hughes was also among the first to use jazz rhymes and dialect to depict the life of urban Black people in his work. He published a second volume of the poetry, Fine Clothes to the Jew, in 1927. Not Without Laughter. After his graduation from Lincoln in 1929, Hughes published his first novel, Not Without Laughter. The book was commercially successful enough to convince Hughes that he could make a living as a writer. During the 1930s, Hughes would frequently travel the United States on lecture tours and also abroad to the Soviet Union, Japan, Haiti. He continued to write and publish poetry and prose during this time, and in 1934 he published his first collection of short stories, The Ways of White Folk. Let America Be America Again. In July 1936, he published one of his most celebrated poems, Let America Be America Again, in Esquire, which examined the unrealized hopes and dreams of the country's lower class and disadvantaged, expressing a sense of hope that one day the American dream would arrive. Hughes would later revise and republish Let America Be America Again in a small anthology of poems called A New Song. In 1937, he served as a war correspondent for several American newspapers during the Spanish Civil War. Simple and More. In 1940, Hughes' autobiography, Up to the Age 28, The Big C, was published. Around this time, Hughes began contributing to a column in the Chicago Defender, for which he created a comic character named Jesse B. Simple, better known as Simple, a Black everyman that Hughes used to further explore urban working class Black themes and to address racial issues. The columns were highly successful, and Simple would later be the focus of several of Hughes' books and plays. In the late 1940s, Hughes contributed to the lyrics for a Broadway musical called Street Scene, which featured music by Kurt Will. The success of the musical would earn Hughes enough money that he was finally able to buy his own house in Harlem. Around this time, he taught creative writing at Atlanta University, today known as Clark Atlanta University, and was a guest lecturer at the university in Chicago for several months. Over the next 2 decades, Hughes would continue his prolific output. In 1949, he wrote a play that inspired the opera Troubled Island and published yet another anthology of work, The Poetry of the Negro, A Dream Deferred. In 1951, Hughes published one of his most celebrated poems, Harlem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, discussing how the American dream falls short for African Americans. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? During the 1950s and 60s, he published countless other works, including several other books from his Simple series, English translations of the poetry of Federico Garcia Lorca and Gabriel Mistral, another analogy of his own poetry. In the second installment of his autobiography, I Wonder as I Wonder. Over the years, many scholars have debated about Langston Hughes' sexuality, with some of them claiming that he was gay, including a number of coded references to male lovers in his poems. Hughes never married or was never publicly linked to any woman, but some biographers have pushed back on these claims. Albeit because during this era, there was large secrecy and homophobia surrounding openly gay men, so there's no concrete evidence of Hughes' sexuality. Hughes' family life was just as complicated. He had a very complex relationship with his mother. Nonetheless, on May 22nd, 1967, Hughes died from complications of prostate cancer. A tribute to his poetry, his funeral contained little in the way of a spoken eulogy, but was filled with jazz and blues music. Hughes may not be physically on planet Earth anymore, but his life's work and legacy will live on forever. Thank you, Langston Hughes. And this has been another episode of Today in Black History. See you tomorrow.